This podcast is created for farmers and powered by Pioneer Agronomy to bring you agronomic insights and proven solutions to fuel forward-thinking farming.
Don, I would love to hear your thoughts on early planted soybeans and why folks are gravitating towards that, or what the advantage is. I hear people talk about getting the soybean plant to flower prior to the summer solstice and, getting into reproduction sooner rather than later, and what kind of impact that can have on yield. I don't think I'm going to do nearly as good of a job explaining that thought process. Would you be able to share any of your musings on that subject?
Yeah, sure. So, it's a passionate topic for me because, we've seen quite a change in the last 10 to 15 years. And I remember getting in front of audiences talking about earlier soybean planting date and talking about planting in that middle of April timeframe, or just April planting period, soybeans period, and having a bunch of growers looking at me like, this guy has got to be a loose cannon. He's crazy, you don't plant beans in April in these conditions. And yet, I had a lot of experience doing that and had not really been failing at it, had been succeeding at it. And so I think other growers started doing that. And now it's, almost becoming the norm to plant soybeans early, or at least the target, the desire. Now, obviously, farmers have a lot to manage going into planting season, so they've got to make decisions. But from a soybean plant perspective, it does a lot because it is one of the most consistent, I would say it's the most consistent management thing you can do to get more yield out of your soybeans is plant them earlier. Now, earlier comes at the expense of how early is too early. And I always tell people, when you think about how much yield you're losing per day on a soybean crop, it's not so much about the day, it's about the GDUs you got in the day you missed. And so when we go real early, sometimes we really don't get any GDUs. So we've just got seeds sitting in the ground and we're not accumulating any GDUs. But as soon as that spring really starts to ramp up and we start cranking out some GDUs, whether it's 10 or 15 GDUs during the day, you really want that soybean plant, in the ground and coming out of the ground and starting to grow. And that's where your yield decline starts. So putting that soybean plant in say March, I've seen people do it. I've done it myself. I typically don't see a yield response that's favorable there. I actually see a negative yield response there because it's a lot of stress on the soybean plant. It's forever getting out of the ground. I mean, 6 weeks, 7 weeks, I've seen them sit in the ground and still emerge.
Okay.
I got to stand, but boy, it didn't turn into yield. But hitting that sweet spot in our area, mid-April into that last half of April, that's when we start to crank up those GDUs. That plant goes in the ground. Yeah, it may take a couple of weeks to get it out, but as soon as we get into those May weather when it's really warming up, that plant's out of the ground and it's starting to grow. And so that triggers it, to start developing sooner. And you think about the longest, sunniest days of the year, they're not just at the summer solstice, they're before the summer solstice and after the summer solstice. And so the more vegetative mass we've got out there in that soybean crop, the more sunlight it's able to capture, and it gets to about the 5th trifoliate and it starts flowering. And I can remember, years like 2012 was a really dry, it turned into a drought year, obviously, but it was really warm coming into March. So we went out and planted beans, in March, and they came right out of the ground. And we had beans flowering before Memorial Day in May.
Oh, wow.
And that bean crop, if we'd have had the water, could have been an amazing crop because it was going to continue to flower all the way into July. So it was going to continue to set yield potential on that plant. So you can get it to flower really early. It doesn't care which side of the summer solstice it's on or if it's on the summer solstice. It used to be believed, boy, if we got them flowering before the summer solstice, we're going to mess up the soybean plant. It's going to get all confused. Okay. Well, it really doesn't get confused. It's totally fine with that. And so what we do by planting earlier is we get that flowering started early. We get a little more sunlight interception during those long sunny days. And that photosynthate is what's key to turning a flower into a pod. And when you think about having at least twice to maybe 3 times as many flowers on the plant as what actually becomes pods, anytime you can turn 1 or 2 extra flowers into a pod, And then you add additional nodes on the plant where you continue to have more flowers later in the season. As the weather kind of ebbs and flows and gets really right for the soybean plant, it adds a little bit more, and a little bit more yield potential. And then we also, the backside of that is the soybean plant really goes into maturity based off of day length as well. So it's, developing through the season, and it's got to get to a certain development point. But as we get into shorter days, as we approach in the fall, we get into cooler nights, that triggers that soybean maturity. So you really expand your growing season by planting earlier, which enables you to capture more sunlight, more water, more CO2, drives more yield potential. And so it's really a consistent way to get soybeans to be higher yielding.
Thank you for listening to this episode from the Pioneer Agronomy team. Be sure to visit pioneer.com/podcasts to access additional episodes and learn more about our extensive on-farm data and innovative digital tools that are fueling forward-thinking farming.